I am Himali Singh Soin, and I'm a poet. And together we are Hylozoic Desires.
And I'm David Soin Tappeser, and I'm a musician, percussionist, composer.
So actually, I've grown up in amidst these wild landscapes because my father is an explorer, and so he had actually been to the Arctic in 1986, the year before I was born, to study the ozone hole. And in fact, in this show, we have a diptych of a 35 slide that he took in the Arctic, superimposed with an image that I took 30 years later in the Antarctic. And it kind of traces this melting world, but also has the ghosts of a burning world. Um, so he was there in the 80s, and then my brother went there just a few years before I went. So there was this kind of polar fascination and also this sense of mystery, like who are we to be there? Like what are South Asians even doing in places like that? We fundamentally don't belong there. And those were the feelings that I went with when I went in 2017, both to the Arctic and the Antarctic. I was so ready to feel out of place that I was actually struck when I found myself making kin with the landscape. And that kinship was formed in those moments when I sensed a state of loss, when you could really clearly see that the ice was receding, when I could see the abandoned ruins of a coal mine. It was in those moments of like also seeing the kind of terracotta clay and the blackness of the coal mine, so recognizing myself in this kind of very white landscape. But there was this sense of grief, the kind of grief that we live with living in a place like India right now, which is a sense of joy, but it's a deep sense of grief. um, the idea with fiction and fictional mythologies came because it seems from the outside that the North and South Pole are these mystical, fantastical spaces. But when you go there, you quickly realize that they are places like any other geography in the world. And in the Arctic, of course, you have indigenous life all over. The region where I was in the Arctic has no indigenous life, that is Svalbard. But my question to the guides always was, what are the legends here? What are the myths? Where are the stories? And they would say, there are no stories because there's no indigenous life here. So I felt like there was this kind of elder who had preserved and archived the stories. That there was a library in front of me, and that was the ice itself. And like indigenous lives all over the Arctic, the ice was losing its language. So, me entering into the archive or entering with fiction into the gaps of the archive was a way to tell its story. And in doing that non human narrative work, I try to also pay homage to indigenous lives in the Arctic without telling their stories. The multiple entry points are not a constraint for me in my universe. The multiple entry points are freedom. The multiple entry points are you need multiple entry points so that there isn't a singular author and a single end or a definite resolution. So the book actually opens both ways, for example, and the end is in the middle, and you choose your own adventure so that you, as a reader, viewer, experiencer, have your own freedom. And in that, you exercise your own politics through it. So I think that form, that method, and that means is quite important and is quite deliberate. Um, in terms of finding the germination, I've been using David Abrams' line quite often these days, but I loved it so much. He's environmental anthropologist and a magician. And he says that us writing Earth or ecology is not being able to connect with non-human life. It's the only way to connect with non-human life, language. He calls it restoring the land in order to restore the land. So for me, of course, I start with text always. And I think the kind of, you mentioned the clairvoyant story and a few others. And of course, there's like glaring gaps in the archives, which you can just see, oh, there's a missing chapter. Let me write that chapter. That's what happens to me. But the piece in the book that typifies this entry point and how to just like find that gap and excavate it is this lovely story of the Andre expedition. It was a Swedish expedition that took a hot air balloon over the North Pole 3 times. And they were convinced that they could kind of circumnavigate the North Pole. And they carried their 3-piece suits and they carried hams and beers with them. I mean, what were they thinking? They had to be light and they carried all this stuff with them. But they had this, the youngest member of the group had just been engaged to this woman, and her name was Anna Charlier. And weirdly, Charlier means like hydrogen balloon. So there's a sense of like great literariness to this story already, but they sabotage themselves and they end up crashing into the snow on this one island. And all throughout, he had been writing love letters to her. And the kind of one of the myths is that this box of love letters is somewhere on that island. It still hasn't been found, but we are opposite like that. On one side opens with a love letter from Nils to Anna. So in a way, that's a method of finding that one gap, that silence, and telling the story. But it's also a way of telling my reader that these are in a way all love letters. I'll just start by saying how we reach the Himalayas, and then maybe you could address ritual and presence and our as
Sure.
grand as what research. But just as the kind of uh, pandemic hit, and maybe like about a year before, we had started working together through We're Opposite Like That. David had made the string quartet for one of the title films of the series. And I was wondering, where does one go after you've gone to the North and South Pole? Like, what is the next research? And in a way, when you've gone the farthest that you can ever go, where do you go next? You go home. And so we found ourselves in the Himalayas, which I'm named after, and where I live also. And we started just doing this research there. And the Himalayas are geographically the plateau, specifically the Tibetan plateau, is called the third pole of the world. And it seemed the third pole was this really lovely metaphorical invitation as well. What is your third pole? Where does it exist? And what is the relationship between these poles? And as soon as you, of course, you have the third pole, you're saying this is an invitation to collaborate, because we're no longer in the world of the binary and the dual. You're suddenly in a much more like proliferating world. And that's where I think that collaboration comes in.
Yeah, and I think coming sort of out of the larger body of We're Opposite Like That, we had a lot of ideas, I think, that continue into As Grand as What, but perhaps in a I wouldn't say a less obvious way, but in a less deliberate way, and they somehow found themselves into the work rather than us imposing it onto it. And all of what you said is true, but it also kind of emerged pretty naturally, almost as an experiment. So we're experimenting, and somehow this body of work started forming and was morphing from one thing into another. And we're kind of wrestling with it for a long time. And that's sort of the product. And I think one of the concerns very much we thought about coming out of that Arctic work was like, what is our relationship to our environment? And in the context of the current sort of, I mean, there's so many names for it, but environmental crisis, climate crisis, we were like, what is that disconnect? What are some of these causes? And we felt, well, one of the disconnects is that we're not reminded of our environments, and what is that reminder that has been lost? And one of those reminders is ritual. And yeah, so we started thinking about how can we recreate ritual as a reminder or reconnector to our environments, and that's how we came up, I guess, with the larger frame for as grand as what.
And we were reading the wonderful Italian philosopher Ernesto Di Martino on the magic of the South, because we were connecting ritual to superstition and to magic, and rituals around creating a different future or a different world for yourself that emanate out of some kind of catastrophe. And we came upon his concept, a crisis of the lost presence, a crisis of lost presence. And we love that it's not simply an environmental catastrophe. And to think about the intersectionality of all the things at play at that moment, it felt right to call it a crisis of lost presence. So, and then simultaneously, I was researching in this Tibetan Buddhist and like these deities that had been kind of lost or a little bit overlooked in the canon. And we came upon La, which is literally this life force. And we thought that's the crisis of lost presence. And of course, we were in the middle of the pandemic in that moment. And one of the symptoms of a lost law or a stolen law was a sense of antisocial behavior and a loss of scent. So we started building this kind of like fictional narrative where in contemporary day it felt accessible. And also, it was important that the film, the video, is not a work of art. It is part of the ritualistic world. So you view the video, and then you sleep, and then you wake, and then you move out. So the video is part of a healing ritual, as opposed to something that tells you how to do something.
It's not
It is
merely thought of as a kind of didactic tool or a documentation. We really thought of it as kind of process itself, like sort of doing what it talks about. And in terms of how the collaboration worked, I don't know. It was
a hot mess.
I was gonna say
it
was a slow evolution.
It's very passionate because we're also a couple. So there's this like interaction deeply of love and artistic practice. And David's primarily a musician, and I'm a poet. And you can imagine that is chaos.
I think you're very right that the idea of the visceral, and I think for both of us, it's quite important to make, as we just said about as grand as what, to make the viewing of our work or the listening to our work something that's an experience that's not only intellectual. At the same time, I think we both think very hard of what we put in there, how we put it in there, but it does not necessarily have to be superficially obvious what's there. You have to dive a little bit deeper. And yes, I think for me, the idea of sound is very much related to creating a mood, but in these more recent works, also of evoking sort of a landscape, right? And this is not necessarily only a physical landscape, but also an emotional landscape. Like, how can I transport people to sort of the universe we want them to inhabit, and which then Himali perhaps populates with her poetry?
I think sound is also a way of coding. For example, the Nagaras have been used by David to replicate Uyghur rhythms a little bit in As Grand as What, and very much so in Static Range, which is a whole different series. But that, for example, has already been shown in the Shanghai Biennale without being censored. Right? So sound is a way of telling stories or embedding protest without saying it, as it were. So in the string quartet, David embedded the like a kind of graph making for the tempo and the dynamics of the piece, the temperature variances between my journey in the Arctic and the Victorian times. So these are subtle, you will never hear it, but the idea is that you will feel it or it's there somehow. And I think that's quite important, even in the way that you've used it in As Grand as What. You've woven Indian ragas with Italian tarantella and all of these, the kind of colonialism that different legacies of sound and music carry with them, and then trying to subvert those.
Yeah, I think that idea of subversion is also important to me. I think all these musical traditions, they somehow carry meaning that people will pick up without necessarily knowing what they are, and then kind of twisting them a little bit. It's something that I'm very fond of and very interested in. But I think another aspect of sound and why it's important to us is that we've talked about this, especially in the context of COVID, quite a lot. And I think it's more powerful actually in our live performances than in the video work, in the audio works, is that it has something that can really touch people. So we have been kind of in this long period of minimal contact and almost being separated and afraid of each other. That sound is somehow that bridges that distance and yeah, has something that vibrates and makes our bodies vibrate together.
In general, I think apart from that is the making of the exhibition, which I think is quite interesting, given that we've together done the show at TBA, and then I've just also recently opened another solo a month later in Chicago. And I think what's been really interesting is to use the thematics of the work and then think about how to translate them into the materiality of the show itself. So in Madrid, we used jute rugs. We used paint that was made out of clay that actually absorbs contaminants from the air. It also had like this shimmer. We used a pool to display We Are Opposite like that, so that suddenly it doubles in on itself. And you have this sense of the materiality of water, even while you're looking at the ice. In Chicago, we've also used all natural materials. And I think that's one element of sustainability. And then the other is working with people in a way that is truly collaborative, nourishing, caring, where it is an infrastructure set up on ethics and on believing that we're not just making a show, we're creating a world. And the way that we treat each other and the amount of space we give each other and the way that we choose to build this tiny little world can be a microcosm. And I think we've been really lucky to have these two solos with amazing institutions and people who've been so caring, in moments that we've needed to take a break, they've given us that break. In moments that we needed to change something, they've allowed for that. And it's all made us richer, more strengthened through it. And I feel like that's the story, that's part of the storytelling.
And yeah, and I think that sort of brings us also back to your first question about how to deal with the many entry points, to deal with the overlapping media, to deal with all of these things. And I think ultimately, I guess the way we work or we try to work is not to see things separately, right? Like the practice does not stay in the frame in a way. It's like it's a whole ecosystem. And
with leaky boundaries.
with leaky boundaries, right? Like personally as well. I mean, where's the work and where's the romantic and where's the private life?
We might be adding too much information to this interview at this moment.
But yeah, so I think it's important for us to carry what we care about in the work also beyond it somehow, and to create these networks of nourishment and of hospitality, something we've been thinking about a lot in our performance setups. How do we present the work? How do we invite the audience? How can we hold them and nourish them and make it more than just a flat kind of viewing experience?